Good morning, everybody. I decided to be something dark and evil this morning because your test is coming up, and I know that you're mad at me for giving you tests, but hey, we got to do this. So I'm Darth Vader. Hope you all had a nice weekend. We do have to talk a little bit about the test, which is a week from today. This is the first time I've ever given a test online like this, so we're still working out some of the kinks, but I promise everything will be fine by Tuesday. But what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about what's going to be on, or what the test is going to be comprised of, and then allow you to ask some questions about the nature of the test. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that now. All right. Oh, I guess I should probably get rid of my Darth Vader face. Okay, hold on. Well, maybe I should be Darth Vader for the whole class. There I am. Okay. Okay. Sorry, everybody. Just getting all this set up. Okay, so we have a test on Tuesday, a week from today. It will cover all the lecture material that we've gone through so far, including Thursday's class, which will probably be on taste. It will cover all the section material, all the discussion section material through yesterday's section. So we will have sections on this coming Monday, the Monday before the test, but that will be presenting new material that will be tested on the final. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but yes, you will have section on Monday, and you will be presented new material, but that new material, which I think will be on touch, will actually be presented on the final. So everything since through yesterday for sections. If you're keeping up with the book, all the book material through chapter 5, including the preface. So there's not a lot of new information in the preface, but I know there are a few questions on the exam that are derived right from the preface that I really don't discuss very much in class that you should make sure you read through. It is an open book exam. Okay, so I believe now there are ways of actually doing proctoring online that the campus is providing, but my first time doing this, you know, one of your first classes taken under the quarantine, so let's just make it open book. Do whatever you want to do, but you do have a restricted amount of time to take the test, and that is 80 minutes. So it's the length of the actual class period, but you will be able to take the test any 80-minute period during the day. So you have to take it once you start the test. You have 80 minutes to finish it. You can't take a break or anything like that. You can't stop the clock. But you can take it any time of the day up until midnight. So you have to finish before midnight. We'll set the constraints up for that. A little information about review. First of all, there are different sets of practice questions that are actually on the iLearn page right now. There's some old practice questions that are still might be kind of useful to you that I always post. But then there are also some of the practice questions that we've been using during the polling that we've been doing during lecture. And one of your wonderful student classmates has forwarded them to me, or at least some of them to me, so I've posted them. I can't promise that they'll all be posted like that. So you should go back and make sure that if you haven't taken screen captures of the practice questions, of the polling questions, you might want to go back to the video and look at those. Those will be a very good thing for you to know to prepare for the test, if you know what I mean. Okay. One last thing about those practice questions, the ones that are derived from the polling, okay, just those practice questions will be removed on Monday night. So I am not going to allow you to refer to those practice questions, at least as they're set up on iLearn, while you're taking the test. You'll see why. It's pretty obvious why. So I will be taking those down Monday night. So just, take a screen capture of that before Monday night if you want to, whatever. I can't in good conscience allow you to post or have access to those during the actual exam. And finally, yes, okay, yes. So on Monday's discussion sections, even though we will be presenting new material, we will also be giving you some time, probably 10, 15 minutes or so at the end of the section period for you to ask questions of the TAs to help you prepare for the test. So that Monday before the exam's May 5th, Tuesday, May 5th, the Monday section, which is May 4th, at those sections, you will be given 10, 15 minutes to ask any questions you want to help you clear up any material you have as you're preparing for the exam. So it's absolutely sensible for you to be studying before your discussion sections on Monday to see what questions you have. They are not going to be doing review sessions for you at that section time, okay? They are just there to ask questions. So, come up with questions that, you just need cleared up. They will answer any questions. They'll be prepared to answer questions. They're just not going to do a review session for you. And then finally, I get questions every once in a while in this class about study guides. The study guide is just the slides. So go through the slides. Just make sure you understand the terms on the slides. Trust me, there's not much more. If I set up a study guide, it might make you feel a little better, but it's just going to be a repetition of what's on the slides anyway. You can figure it out. If you go through the slides and you're understanding all the material in the slides, if you go through the book and find material that we didn't have a chance to cover, and if you've taken notes or have a chance to go back and listen to the discussion sections, you should do absolutely fine. Okay, it's going to be the most straightforward, I think, easiest exam I've ever given in my life. We talked about the philosophy of this class during quarantine, and I of course want you to learn things, and hopefully you will learn things, but I also see this course as a way for you to get engaged in material so you can, be distracted from everything that's going on. I don't want you to feel stressed for the exam. I know that's not going to help some of you anyway. You're going to feel a little nervous about it. But I think if you've been keeping on top of things, you should do really, really, really well. Okay, let me take a second here and answer some questions. Okay. Oh, will there be lecture? Oh, that's a very good question. So Aida asked if there will be a lecture on next Tuesday. No, I should have said that. Thank you for saying that. I'm going to give you a break from lecture on Tuesday. So you can either take the exam during class time or study for the exam during class time. I would love to lecture because there's so much material, and we've been having so much fun that I've run out of some time, but I don't want to overstress you. So no class on Tuesday. Oh, you love the dark side. Jubes says that they love the dark side. Good, then I'm glad I could help with Darth Vader. My favorite Star Wars movie, probably the second one I saw when I was young, which is, whichever it's called, I can't remember now. Goes A New Hope, and then the next one, which I guess is the fifth in the series, the one where they introduce Yoda, and it's Luke, I am your father. Empire Strikes Back, is that right? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, that's my favorite still. Do you know how many questions on the test? Asked James, and I think it's going to be somewhere between 60 and 70, so you should have more than enough time to answer all the questions. It turns out to be more than a minute a question, and believe it or not, that's a lot of time. So we're still working on this test. We're still kind of fine-tuning things, me and the section leaders, your TAs, but it should be about that. Will we be able to backtrack during the test? I sure hope so. That's a very good question. And if anyone knows the answer to that right now, I'd appreciate finding out. I've never given a test like this before, but boy, I would be frustrated with iLearn if you're not allowed to backtrack. I will definitely get the answer for that by Thursday, but when I used to take tests when, I was an undergraduate, I would sometimes go through the test and it would help me learn things that I could then go back to the beginning of the test and understand and answer better. So boy, do I want you to be able to backtrack. I hope you can backtrack. If anyone knows that for sure, let me know now if that's an option. Aylin asks, will we receive an automatic grade after? Okay. These are all great questions. I do not actually want you to get your grades until we look over the tests to make sure there's no questions we have to throw out. I thank you for asking that question because I should have put that on the slide. I'm not sure we can set it up so that it doesn't give you your raw score. If it does give you your raw score after you take the exam, you say finished, click, and up comes a raw score. Take that with a grain of salt because we might in fact be removing some questions and it's not going to be indicative of your letter grade, right? So, there's a big curve and especially this quarter, and we don't want you to get stressed. So if we can't figure out how to prevent that number from coming up, we don't want you to see a number just so you don't get stressed. Don't worry about the number too much because we're going to probably have to remove a couple of questions. We often do during the exam if everyone misses something, and at the very least we're going to actually we're going to assign a letter grade, a general letter grade, to give you a sense long after we look at all the performance of the class together. By the way, I should mention something about the letter grade. We're not going to calculate that final letter grade until you take the final exam, but we will give you a sense after the midterm what range you're in, but that will not be for a few days until after everyone's finished with the exam. So hopefully by Thursday, I'll give you some sense of what the letter grade assignment will be, but boy, we don't want you to infer anything based on that initial score, okay? You know what, let me say something about Baby Yoda, because Thomas asked about Baby Yoda. I have not watched the show, the Baby Yoda Experience. I have not watched the show, but both my boys love it. They think they did a really great job with it, and I've seen pictures of Baby Yoda, and he seems perfectly cute. But I have not watched it, so I can't really say very much about it. The Empire Strikes Back. Thank you, everyone chimed in. The Empire Strikes Back. How many questions? Are you going to be multiple questions displayed on one page? Oh my gosh. Okay, so there's a lot of, I guess, detailed questions now about the format of how the exam is administered, and I apologize. I have not given an exam like this before. I don't know if we can make a selection of just presenting one question at a time, or you can see all the questions. I'll have to figure that out. I'm really sorry. This is all new to me and the TAs. But I will do whatever I can to try to make it as easy as possible. So, optimally, what I'd like to do is give you an exam experience as if you had the sheets of paper there and we're taking it on a Scantron, because you can always go back and forth and look at multiple questions at a time. I will do as much as possible because I don't want people to do worse on the exam or to get more stressed on the exam because of the presentation style. So I will do everything I can to make this as familiar as possible to you. It depends on how we set up the test. We go back to any question. We can go back to questions on iLearn. Good. That's good to hear. I will figure that out. Let's go back. Good. We can go back. People, thank you very much for chiming in. We can put them all on one page. This is great. You know more about this than I do. We can back on iLearn. All questions will be multiple choice. They will be in the exact format as the polling questions. Exact format. Wink, wink. Okay. Baby Yoda. Someone's singing Baby Yoda. Good. All right. That's great. Okay, great. That should do it for the questions. We got a lot of material to cover, so I want to make sure we get into that. God, it's a cool background, isn't it? Look, there's little people working down there, and they're probably ready to blow up a planet, with innocent lives. That is so cool. Okay, anyway, let's go back cool. Okay, let's start talking about this. Boy, is this fun, and let's see how I feel about it. But people seem so interested in this material on scent that I think we don't need to do too much entertaining. In other words, I'm not going to play guitar today, probably. But if I feel like we're getting a little sluggish here, I might do a magic trick or something like that. Maybe not, depending on how much time we have. Anyway, we're going right into the new material, not doing a little review like I often do, but let me just give you a big picture. What we've been talking about is odor. We've been talking about scent and how the nose uses scent to do some things that we would absolutely have no idea what we could do. And that involved recognizing siblings, recognizing friends through scent, all those really cool things that we've been discussing that if given a chance in a laboratory experiment, we seem to be able to perform some really miraculous things. But really, I think from my perspective, one of the coolest things that your nose does is it continues to process odor even when you're unaware of it. And this is one of the things I just found so stinking interesting, so to speak. You come into a new room. So I've been desperately trying to bake bread here, to keep myself busy, and it continually fails. All my friends are posting all this sourdough starter stuff on Facebook, and everyone's so proud of themselves, and I keep on failing again and again and again. But if you come to my house, it's always going to smell like bread now because I'm so desperate to finally get this to work. And you would notice when you first walked in the room, yes, I smell bread. This is a very striking smell of bread. But then after a while, you sit down, relax, and you would probably stop noticing that smell of bread, even though it's a very, very striking smell at first. There's a commercial that says you become nose blind after a while, and that's absolutely true. You become accommodated to the smell consciously. And this is the cool thing. You aren't aware of it anymore. It's kind of a way for your smell system to allow you to be more conscious of other smells that come in. But consciousness really isn't the only thing that's at play here. It's the subliminal odors, the ones that are now below your level of threshold of consciousness, that seems to still go through your brain and be processed. And I have a story. I love to tell this story in all its detail, but I'm going to go through it a little bit more quickly than usual. Your book does a perfectly fine job describing these folks. These two crazy folks here that you see in your slide, Mark Peltier and Eileen Kenny, real colorful folks, old hippies. What they ended up doing is designing odors for environmental or I guess locations in various department stores and hotel rooms, that sort of thing. And Mark, who you see there, is the one who designed the dispersion system, and that's actually what you're seeing right here, this little system that disperses a chemical through the ventilation system of the hotels and department stores and casinos that they use these things in. Eileen, on the other hand, is the one that designs the odors. And they have had tremendous success doing this. So basically what they do is they design the scent, and then in designing the scent, Eileen tries to match it to the decor of the location. And the book discusses some interesting kind of principles she uses to match different components of the odors to different types of decor, whether they're a casino or whether they're a department store, whether it's in the baby part of the department store, the baby section, or the young women's or the men's section. She will have a different scent for each of those sections. Okay, they became most famous and most successful, though, based on their one of their first jobs, which was to design an odor for the Mirage Hotel. Okay, the Mirage Casino. Now, this is one of the casinos that what's his name owns? Jeff Wynn, is that his name? Jeff Wynn, is it, or something like that? He's the guy that the Ocean's 11 Andy Garcia character is based on. He owns tons of casinos, real kind of smooth guy. And the Mirage Casino was a kind of a landmark casino in that it was one of the first kind of casino complexes that catered to all types of tourists, not just the gambling tourists. So the Mirage is the one where Siegfried and Roy used to perform. They have a zoo in back if you've ever been there. It's really kind of cool. They have a dolphin show and all that sort of stuff. And Steve Wynn, I think it is, Steve Wynn. What he wanted them to do, Eileen and Mark, was to try to get an odor that would, make people kind of want to be there. And it worked. It worked. I mean, they think, because when the Mirage opened, and then through its first year of existence, it was by far the most popular casino. And there's an interesting story about what the components of the smell are for that casino. But what happened, as soon as they saw that the smell seemed to be something people would, review favorably in the casino, say, oh yes, we do like the smell, even though they wouldn't notice it after a while. Every other casino wanted the exact same smell that Mark and Eileen had designed for the Mirage. Now, what they ended up designing, you can read in the book, was a smell that was kind of like a vacation sort of smell. That's what Steve Wynn said, is I want to smell that kind of makes people think that they're on a vacation. And it took them a long time to find that. And then Eileen said, oh, he just wants the smell of suntan lotion, which is kind of what the smell is. If you go to the Mirage, it's kind of like a coconut sort of smell when you first walk in there, like the suntan lotion smell. And that's what they put in the Mirage. But then the next one to open, I don't know if you know this one. This is the one. Oh God, I can't remember the medieval one. I can't remember what it's called. Medieval time? No, it's the one that looks like a giant miniature golf course. Component. Like it's a giant kind of medieval castle that looks extra cheesy. They wanted the same coconut smell in their casino because it had such success. And what was being considered then was the idea that Mark and Eileen had designed an odor that had a coercive, kind of a hypnotic influence over the gamblers, over the patrons. That yes, they could smell it when they came in, but that smell continued to work after people lost their awareness of it. And that kind of kept them in the casino. And some investigative reporting was done on this and everything, thinking, oh, they've come out with a smell that coerces people, that it kind of hypnotizes people, so it kind of bypasses their desire, their will to stay, and forces them to stay there. But that's very unlikely. There is no evidence that anything that kind of major in a behavioral change can be changed with smell. In fact, I think the way to interpret this is that smell here adds to the decor, adds to the ambience of the hotel. Now, it does so often in a less conscious way, but it doesn't force you to stay at the Mirage. It is one of the things that's added, like the music that goes on at the Mirage, the colors, the giant fish tank that's behind the main desk there. All those things are components that make people want to stay at the Mirage longer. And I think the odor is the same thing. That being said, okay, it can do so without you being aware of it. That's different from coercion. It just means that, in fact, your brain is constantly using odor, but most of the time it never reaches consciousness. And there's research that suggests this sort of thing. So the first I'll just discuss very quickly. Imagine yourself being in basically you're in an experiment where they're kind of telling you to do what Eileen Kenny does, right? Well, the way it works first, okay, there's actually two parts to this experiment. You go into a room, a classroom in the university. You sit down and you, I guess you're asked to do math problems or something like that, something very, very simple. And you do your math problems, and they say, oh, that's the first part of the experiment, but actually we have kind of two experiments here. The second part, we're going to ask you to be a scent designer and match different scents that they place in front of a person to different rooms on campus. So you see different pictures of rooms, so other classrooms, lecture halls, smaller kind of meeting rooms, all different rooms on campus, and you have all these scents in front of you, and your job is to say which scent goes best with which room, which people say, that's a really weird thing to do, but kind of fun. I'll do it, sure. And they'll do that. They'll match the orange scent to, say, the lecture hall, the strawberry scent to the meeting room, that sort of thing, okay? However, when the person was doing the math test, okay, there was actually a very, very kind of kind of weak scent of peppermint that was being presented, but not noticeable. And in all these experiments I'm going to be talking about, the scent is never noticeable. Very, very weak, okay? And after they left that room and then went to another room to try to match the smells to all these different rooms, when they saw a picture of that first room, guess what smell they choose? They choose the peppermint for that room. And, again, they'll be asked, are you sure? Are you sure that you weren't aware of the peppermint smell in that first room? They say, no, absolutely not. I had no idea what this experiment was about. But in fact, you make a subliminal association between the unconscious odor and the room, which is pretty cool, okay? Next part, and I think this is actually one of my wife's favorite experiments. You'll see why in just a second. Living with three guys. This is an experiment where people are put into a small laboratory room and asked to do a number of different tasks. Now, in that small room, there is a very low, very weak, undetectable odor of a cleaner, Pine Sol, say. Pine Sol is pretty strong, but imagine another kind of cleaner that could be very weak. People do not notice it. Again, they're asked multiple times throughout the experiment, do you smell anything? Do you smell anything? And certainly at the end, they're asked in detail if they smelled anything, right? But here's what happens, okay? Again, most people do not smell anything. They just think they're doing an experiment in a room in front of a computer. And they're doing things like this. They're reading words. They're asked for their plans for the rest of the day. And then the cleaning behaviors I'll mention in just a second. Okay. So they're in front of a computer and words come up one at a time. And their job is just to read the word that's on the screen. So table, okay? Apple comes up and they say the words as quickly as possible. If the words are related to cleanliness, soap, okay, washing, bathtub, they read those words a little bit more quickly than they read the other words. Okay, again, undetectable smell, right? Then, after that part of the experiment's done, they'll just have them fill out a questionnaire. And one of the questions is, what are you planning on spending the rest of your day doing after you leave the laboratory? And as it turns out, if people do have this undetectable smell in the room, they are more likely to say something having to do with cleanliness or organizing or trying to kind of, I don't know, do something that kind of takes order of a situation as one of their plans. Okay, so if that odor is there undetectable, they'll say, oh, I'm going to wash my car later today, or I'm going to finally clean up my room, or I'm going to finally clean up all those kind of wayward files on my computer desktop, that sort of thing. Of course, there's another group in the experiment that doesn't get the scent, so at all. There's no scent in the room at all. So there's a comparison. But if that scent is there, you are kind of slowly kind of drawn to think about cleanliness and clean behaviors for later in your day. And then finally, my favorite part of this study. If you're in that experimental group that has that undetectable odor, one that you can't notice in the room of cleaning, when you're given a cookie for your reward for being in the experiment, a thank you for being in the experiment. Okay, you get experimental credit now. That goes towards your course. And thank you so much. We're going to give you a cookie. These are fresh baked. Go ahead and enjoy your cookie while we go get your receipt for being in the experiment, your credit receipt for being in the experiment. So they leave the room. The experimenter leaves the room. The person sits there with their cookie. They eat the cookie. There is a hidden camera in the room. And what they notice is if that low-level scent is in the room, people will eat and then clean up after themselves more. They'll eat more clean, and then they'll clean up after themselves with a little napkin that's given. They'll kind of put the crumbs in their hand and put everything in the trash like they should. If that odor is not in there, okay, they won't be as clean in eating their cookies. So what it suggests is that there is a subliminal odor, one that's not detectable, that can have subtle but kind of systematic influences over very, very subtle behavior. Now, these are tiny little changes, because I know what you're thinking. You say, Rosenblum just said that smells can't coerce us. Well, what's going on here? You might call this coercion, but it is a tiny, tiny little effect. It's not like, if you get the smell in there and this undetectable smell, you're say, I'm not going to eat this cookie. Instead, I'm going to wrap it up and give it back to you or something like that. Or, my next plan is I wasn't going to do this, but now I'm going to go home and clean my bathroom because, it's needed it for so long, even though I really don't want to do it. It's not going to make you do any of those things. It just has these kind of very, very subtle effects. Okay, not unlike, if it were, I imagine if you were in a laboratory room that was completely spotless, right? You would probably clean up that cookie a little bit more versus a laboratory room that was a little disorganized, like our laboratory rooms, and had, like old computers on the floor and a stack of papers over here. You might be less likely to clean up. What odor does is it adds to the decor. It adds to your sense of the room. So it kind of has a small influence. Again, it's not an influence that would be any bigger than what I just, discussed, the cleanliness, the visible cleanliness of a clean laboratory room versus a kind of, disorganized laboratory room. It's going to have that same sort of effect. Okay, two more things I wanted to say about this. More unconscious sort of influences. One is that you can smell in your sleep, and this I just found fascinating. I didn't think that you would at all be influenced by smells in your sleep, but it turns out that, if you go to a sleep lab and you are hooked up to a machine, they just put, basically little stickers on your head and your eyelids and whatever, and you fall asleep. When it comes time for your dreaming phase, if a smell is piped through the room, again, a very weak smell, it will, in fact, affect what you dream of. So if it's if you're sleeping, you're not conscious, you're sleeping, and you have you start to dream, and they start pumping in a flowery smell, it will likely be incorporated into the content of your dreams. I'd say, well, I was, walking down a street, and all of a sudden I came upon a flower patch, or I was in a department store and there was a very flowery perfume that I noticed, that sort of thing. So it can get into your dream content like that. And then finally, when it comes to sleep, and this is really interesting, I think, memory consolidation. And what this means is as follows. We do know, and this is good for you to know if you haven't learned this before, that sleep and different phases of sleep help you consolidate the memories of your day. Okay, they help you kind of organize the memories of your day. So it's always, so you've always been told in high school that it's a good thing to get a good night's sleep before an exam. It's absolutely true. And it's not just so you feel rested. It's true because it actually affects the learning, okay, which is important. This is good to know, right? So when make sure Monday night you get a good night's sleep. But there's another piece of this. And that is that if you can study right up to the point where you go to sleep, so you study and then rather than watching the next episode of Ozark, right, you just go right to sleep. That information before you sleep is going to be retained better. Okay, those are good things for you to know to study for the test. But here's something having to do with odor. If, in fact, you are studying for the exam and there's a very kind of weak scent of, say, I don't know, what do we want to put in here now? Strawberry. You don't notice it as you're studying through this material, but there's a very weak scent of strawberry there. Cool. Then you go to sleep immediately. If when you go into your dream phase of sleep, the experimenters then put another scent of strawberry into the room, you will actually remember that material better the next day. I mean, this is really cool. In other words, that scent, unconscious, you're sleeping, that scent is going to help you remember the material that you learned when that strawberry smell was being presented as you were studying. The scent helps you remember during your dream phases so you perform better on the test the next day. Okay? It's very cool stuff. I knew this was going to happen. There's lots of questions. Let me answer them quickly. I might not be able to answer all of them because We have so much material to cover, but I know you're interested, so let's do that. Cool. Okay. Oh, Excalibur, thank you very much. How could I forget? It's a horrible hotel. Okay, it's good to know. Yes, couldn't it just be that the pleasant smell makes the visitors more comfortable? And I think that's absolutely true, Alex. If it smells exactly right, but it smells nice somewhere, you enjoy staying there longer. And that's exactly the point Eileen and Mark would make. But here's the kind of difference that made people a little kind of intimidated by the situation. And that is that the smell, your conscious awareness of the smell, leaves. Now, so at some point, it shouldn't make a difference, right? That's what they're thinking. Well, our awareness of the smell no longer is there, so that's not going to keep me at the hotel. But the truth is, your unconscious brain continues to process that smell, and probably evaluates its pleasantness, and in that sense, it's an unconscious influence over your, I guess, your experience of pleasantness, and that intimidated people. They thought, uh-oh, that's what's the hypnotizing part of this that's going on. But it isn't. It's just that your brain, continues to evaluate the pleasantness and decides that you should stay. Not because it's hypnotizing you, it's just because it's pleasant. And guess what else is pleasant? That fish tank is so cool, the one behind the desk, and all the fake palm trees and the white tigers and all that stuff. That's all pleasant. These things, though, we're usually more conscious of, the fish tank, the lion, all that stuff, tiger. But the smell is something that we lose consciousness of, and that's a little bit, I guess, I don't know, intimidating, scary to people when they think about it. So would different scents influence us differently? That's a very good question, and you've heard about kind of different sorts of scent therapy and things like that. It's unclear that any of those things really work unless we know how they are associated with different things in one's life, potentially. And to the degree they work, the unconscious influence is going to be subtle. That doesn't mean that it doesn't help you relax. If when you were young, you grew up with a jasmine plant outside. We have some here. It's a beautiful smell, and a subtle jasmine smell comes. You use a subtle jasmine smell in your room when you're stressed, and it helps you relax. That's great. That's great. I'm all for that. But do know that's not really that different, at least when you're aware of it, than listening to calming music. I like to, when I read, I like to listen to kind of ambient music, which is kind of a lyrics. It doesn't have words, lyrics, singing or anything like that, and it kind of fills in the background. It helps me relax. It helps me concentrate, and it's in that sense, it's very much like scent. The difference is, though, I can always become aware of that music. I am consciously able to tap into that at any time. The scent of jasmine might not have that same thing. Okay, what else? Do smells introduced during dream state make the dream more memorable or prominent? That is a great question, and I bet Matthew, you could go online and find that answer. I do not know the answer to that. The papers I read about dream content just talked about what the dreams were like. And usually in those experiments, those sleep experiments, what they do is after the person is done dreaming and they go into the next phase of their sleep, the experimenters run in and they go, wake up, we got to know what your dreams are about. So in other words, they have to make sure that they can get a report from the sleeper on the dream content before they go into another dream state and might forget it. So I don't know if that's true, but it's a really great question. Will we talk about flashbulb memory? We will later on. So let's save that. It's a good question, Aida. I think it's a really interesting, yeah, we'll talk about it, not next class, but in a few classes. Is that why they tell you to chew gum when you're studying and then again? Okay, yeah, so Elizabeth asked a really cool question. So they tell you to chew gum when you're studying and then chew that same gum later on. And this is a general idea of something called state-dependent memory. And the idea is if you can study under the same conditions in which you'll be taking the test. So if you can study in the exam room, you can study with your favorite pencil, probably you guys are going to be in good shape because you're probably going to be studying, in the same room. You'll be taking the test in on the same computer and all that sort of thing. Yes, the state does help. Having a similar, kind of context, visible context, audible context, all that does help. The question Elizabeth's asking is really interesting, and that is that why the gum thing, she's been told to chew the same gum, does help. And yes, it could be that, probably what comes through on gum besides the sweetness is the smell is going to influence the taste. And that could be, in fact, one of the reasons that does tend to work. So yeah, I don't know for certain, but I think it's a very, very good inference. Does smell require to have other senses to remember in-depth memories? Another good question, Aida. I don't know. Required to have other senses to remember. So do you need to remember, does the smell need to be associated with something in order for it to be a deep, I assume, emotional memory? And I think, yeah, the answer is going to be yes. I don't think you can remember a smell abstractly on its own and have it emotional. It has to be associated with some emotional event. And if, I think this was something you went over in discussion section, but if not, you can read it in the book. The story about how smell affects our emotional memories is very, very interesting. Okay, cool. Okay, let me do a poll question just because it's helpful for you folks. Let's see here. Yeah, let's ask a question very quickly about anosmia. Okay, so anosmia is an ailment in which patients A, often have trouble hearing high pitches, B, often have trouble smelling, C, often have trouble tasting, like tasting their food, or D, both B and C. I think you're going to ace this one. Think about anosmia, think about how it's diagnosed, think about Carl Wunsch, and we'll see how you do. Yeah, I knew it. So you can see, I'm just, as you're finishing this off, that was 30 seconds, and most of you had no trouble answering the question. I'll give you a few more seconds, just so you know that with a minute a question, you're going to have no problem at all. And I think you're going to get about a minute and a half a question, depending on how many questions we come up with for this exam, and the fact that you have 80 minutes to finish it. Okay, you guys did great. Let me end the poll and give you the results. Anosmia is an ailment in which patients, it has nothing to do with sound, it has nothing to do with hearing. It does have to do with smelling. That is absolutely true. So 20% of you said that they have trouble smelling. However, I think most of you realized, 80%, that trouble smelling also has an influence on your taste. And as we talked about Carl Wunsch, we talked about the fact that he first noticed that he was having trouble smelling after he noticed he had trouble tasting his food. So very often anosmia is, in fact, diagnosed with people who are having trouble tasting their food. And that, I think I mentioned this on last class, that this is something that doctors are now using to diagnose the coronavirus in some patients. One of the first things they report is, they might say, I have headaches and maybe a little trouble breathing, but they say, but I'm really aware of the fact that I'm having trouble tasting my food. And then they'll, have them go through a smell test or something like that. And they'll say, oh yeah, you're having trouble tasting your food because it's affected your nasal system, your olfactory system. You probably have trouble smelling too. This is temporary, it will go away, but yeah, this is a way that they're diagnosing. So trouble tasting food is one of the diagnostic characteristics of the coronavirus, and it is because of this temporary anosmia that the virus, in fact, induces. So the correct answer there is D, the last one. Great. Okay, you guys are doing good. Let's get rid of this. Okay. And go back to our discussion. Big on the Star Destroyer. Oops, shoot. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so let's move on from Mark and Eileen and talk about one of the things that I think you're going to be very surprised that we can smell, and that is the smell of fear. So this is how this research is done. I think this is so interesting. What happens is odor samples are taken from stressed men. Now, they can be stressed in a number of different ways. They can be stressed by taking an odor sample like right after they come off a roller coaster. This guy looks especially scared, doesn't he? Yeah. The gals are handling it better, I think. But that's one way of doing it. The other way is, this is actually done often, is they are taking, those sweat samples are taken from men as they are going into an exam. So Tuesday, hopefully your exam won't be as stressful as the ones that they actually take. I think is what they do is they'll take sweat samples from men going into the SATs, or men going into medical school exams, things that are really, exams that are very stressful, that have a lot of weight on them. And then what they'll do is they'll take those samples and present them to people at undetectable levels. And there's a whole technology of how that's done. I won't get into it, but it involves people wearing kind of like a little, kind of nasal cannula, those little tube things that go into your nose. And typically they just say, okay, we're going to give you a little oxygen. Sometimes they'll put another smell in there that will cover up the smell of the sweat. But it isn't a bacteria sort of smell. It's not like, when you run and you smell your underarms and they smell, very, very kind of pungent. This is a smell that's not very detectable to begin with. And then they decrease the amount of sweat that's actually on the, that's coming through the nasal cannula. And people don't notice it at all. They say, do you smell anything? It's like, no, I just feel oxygen coming through there. But there actually is a way of presenting it at an undetectable level. As they're doing this, subjects in these experiments are asked the following questions. So let's look down here. They're asked a question of which one of these faces is smiling and which one of these faces is frowning. Okay. And as you can see here, these faces are very similar. I would say this one's smiling up here, number one, and this one down here is maybe frowning a little bit, but there's a kind of a continuum. Some of these are kind of in between a little bit. Yeah, I don't know. Imagine they are maybe a little bit in between. So you're getting kind of a continuum of happy face to sad face. And the question is, at what point, as the faces change their expressions in the photographs, are they evaluated as sad versus happy? And the kind of percentage of faces that you will evaluate as either sad or scared or angry, the more negative faces will increase, okay, if in fact you have this fearful smell unconsciously going into your nose. So it influences, this undetectable odor sample influences facial expressions. So it influences your perception of facial expressions. So you're more likely to evaluate the faces as negative if you have that unconscious smell going in. Again, you're more likely to evaluate, say, this one in the middle that's maybe very neutral as negative if, in fact, you are being presented unconsciously, undetectably, a scared smell from a person that's been scared. Okay, what else? The startle reflex. Okay, do we have an example of a startle reflex? Yeah, sure. Here's one. Oh. Okay. Want to know what the startle reflex is? This. Okay. It's done with bongos. No, not necessarily. Hit that hard. Do your eyes blink? Yeah, that's the startle reflex. Here, let me do it right here with the microphone. It's loud. That was great. Okay, that's the startle reflex. And it can be measured by the a degree that your eyelids actually blink. So when you heard that, you might have gone like that. If it was a quieter sound, it'll blink, but it will be less of a kind of large blink. If, however, you are being presented this undetectable fearful smell, that smell taken from a scared man, it will amplify the startle reflex. So that's what this image is trying to convey right here, that here's the startle reflex. You will blink from a loud sound, okay? It's not usually done with a bongo, but why not? But the degree to which you will blink is, in fact, amplified if you're getting the undetectable smell of somebody who's been scared. That's pretty cool. What else? It makes you, well, this, you know, okay, I'll do this very quickly. I believe it is on the exam. It is a tiny bit more complicated than it's worth the story for, but it actually can make people a little bit more kind of attentive on an exam or on an experiment. So, you know, in this experiment, people are asked to say whether two words are related or unrelated. Hat, cap is related, leg, cup are two words that are unrelated. In fact, you will do better you'll be faster at saying a pair of words is related versus unrelated if you're getting that fearful smell, okay? So what that fearful smell will do is it will influence your impression of facial expressions, make that perception more negative. It amplifies that loud sound startle reflex, and it actually can make a person more vigilant, more attentive on the exam. Again, all these subjects are completely unaware that there's a smell coming through this cannula, right? Completely unaware. But there is this influence. And there's an influence that seems to be larger for individuals who on a personality test turn out to be more anxious, okay? So, you know, there's very simple tests we can administer to find out what sort of, you know, personality traits of an individual has. And if the person ends up more on the anxious side of the continuum versus more, you know, kind of laid back side, those people that would be on the anxious side would be more influenced by this undetectable, fearful smell that is being presented to them. Okay. This, I should say, and I don't know if this is actually in the book because this is more recent research, but this also does work for disgust. So if a smell of a person who is being disgusted by something they're seeing, or something, you know, that they're maybe that, you know, a food that's you know, particularly kind of gross, if that smell sweat sample is taken from them, it will have very subtle influences over how, you know, a subject performs on a task, like the sort of things that you just saw. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but know that it works for more than just smell, for fear. Okay. So what does this mean? What does this mean that we can smell fear? Like, I'm sure you've heard this sort of story before, not about us, but about dogs, right? Dogs can smell our fear, and that's what makes them aggressive. I'm not sure there's a lot of evidence that changes a dog's behavior that much, and it's not a lot of evidence that to the degree it can, that it comes from smell. Dogs can probably pick up on a lot of cues of a person who's scared of them, or is that is uncomfortable with a dog, that sort of thing. But the idea that people can detect this sort of thing, okay? Well, what we do know is that it's absolutely true in the animal world, especially, maybe not so clearly with dogs, but with ants, mice, deer, amoeba, okay? If any of these animals smell another of its own species scared, then it will behave in a scared way. Right? So if an ant is walking around doing his, you know, daily ant business, and all of a sudden smells where another ant had been threatened, it will say, whoa, that is a scary smell, I am out of here, and will hightail it. Same with mice, same with deer. They can smell, a deer can smell when another deer has been scared and will stay away from that area. And you can understand how that is something that benefits the species, right? To stay away from particularly harmful areas in their environments. Is this also true of people? Well, again, these are very subtle effects with people, right? So when you are presented that undetectable smell of a fearful person, it doesn't make you run. Okay. It doesn't make you want to get out of the room immediately or anything like that. Ants, I mean, you can do this to ants. Ants will just like scatter immediately. Mice will too. You can see them like it's a reflex in these little guys. But people don't have that sort of reaction, okay? Our reactions differ. Yes, we can show very subtle influences of smelling unconsciously somebody else's fear, but it's not like a reflexive reaction that we have where all of a sudden, our behavior completely changes, right? So, when you're getting, so imagine you're in that face perception experiment, you're evaluating faces, and all of a sudden that undetectable smell of a fearful person comes in. It's going to subtly influence how you judge the faces, not make you get out of that room, right? It's not like, oh my gosh, this is a scary place, I gotta go. It's a very, very subtle response when it comes to people. It's an important thing to remember. Well, we know this is, much more kind of dramatic, much more controlling in other animals. For us, it doesn't seem to have that type of effect. Okay, we'll keep that in mind as we go through some of these other things. This is an interesting story, and this has to do with fertility and what we call menstrual entrainment. And you might have heard about this research before. This is always research you learn at some point along the way, whether it's in high school, whether it's in college, about a researcher named Martha McClintock, and there she is right there. And I was lucky enough to interview her. She's now retired, but she's very famous for this study she did as an undergraduate. Okay, something to think about. It was an undergraduate senior thesis. And what she noticed, just casually in her dorm room, was that after living a while with other women in her dorm, she was in an all-women's college, Wellesley College. After living with women in a dorm for a while, their menstrual cycles seemed to entrain. What do we mean by entrain? They seem to kind of match up. So the women would go through their cycle. So, they went through their period at the same time, roughly during the month. And that would not occur when people came, when they first came to live in the dorm. They'd all have their cycles at different times of the month. But after living together, they would seem to synchronize together. That's what entrainment means here, that they're synchronized. The menstrual cycles are now synchronized. And certainly after 4 months living in the dorms, they'd see a lot of synchronization. She would see a lot of synchronization. And we know this type of thing does happen with other animals. It happens with mice. And a lot of research has studied how when mice are kind of cohabitating, their menstrual cycles will synchronize up. And we do know how this occurs with mice. It occurs through mice through odor. This kind of mysterious odor, I guess we can say, called pheromones. The question is whether people are also influenced by pheromones. So these are secretions. Pheromones are kind of these secretions that the body gives off that can influence another person's body to kind of change its metabolism a little bit. Possibly, I shouldn't have used the word people. I should have used the word mouse or deer or something like that. Other animals secrete this chemical that seems to be detected by the olfactory system of another animal of its species, and it affects their bodies. So their menstrual cycles of mice cohabitants or deer cohabitants synchronize. Okay. And this was huge when she reports this in a paper in Nature, one of the most important scientific journals in the world. And people thought, there's just no way this can happen. And there was a lot of criticism over her research methods. This poor, 19, 20-year-old publishing in Nature and then having to go to these conferences defending herself, with these world-renowned scientists. And she said it was very difficult. She got a lot of criticism. There was some, all of this was done, all this research was done with self-reports of when people's cycles were matching up to each other. And also there was some evidence that in terms of how close the cycles would synchronize, friends seemed to synchronize more than roommates did. So you know better than anybody if you're in the when you were living in the dorms last quarter, that your best friend isn't always your roommate. As your weeks go on in college, you can be very good friends with your roommate, but you have a little bit more in common with somebody down the hall, and you end up spending a little bit more time with them, possibly. Okay, not at night necessarily. You're sleeping with your roommate. But what they found was that friendships were more predictive of synchrony than actual proximity, how close people were living together. So they thought, well, so, this is not the case. We know with mice, the closer the mice are living together, the more synchrony happens. It seems like it's a little deviating for humans. So she goes out, gets her PhD, and her PhD thesis had to do with another question related to menstrual synchrony and the possibility that pheromones are influencing us like they are influencing mice and deers. And what she did now was something I think very smart. She decided to control things in a much more consistent manner and use what's called this double-blind procedure, but I'm not going to go into the details of how this works. Just know it's considered a very rigorous method of testing these sort of things. And what she did is she took sweat, underarm sweat, from women who were ovulating versus women who were in the pre-ovulation phase of their cycle. Okay, so she had after many weeks, she had a collection of scents from women who were in the ovulation phase of their cycle, and then women who were just before that phase. And she then applied it to a new group of women who weren't, part of the donor groups on the upper lip. And so, it's a very, very, it's undetectable. It's a very, very weak smell if it's not something that can be detected at all. But she kind of just rubbed. I think it was also, I should say that these sorts of smells can still be effective if they are kind of covered in alcohol, which is interesting. So alcohol in this case does not kill the sort of chemicals that can influence a smell and reactions to smell. So maybe these secretions were placed in alcohol that were rubbed on the upper lip. And so a person might say, oh yeah, I can smell the alcohol, but they wouldn't be able to smell anything else, okay? And depending then on whether you were in the receiving group that got the scent from ovulating women versus pre-ovulating women, your menstrual cycle very kind of subtly shifted in one direction or the other. Okay, if you were given the scent of a woman who is ovulating, okay, even though you weren't aware of it, your cycle would speed up a couple of days. If, on the other hand, you were given the scent of the woman that was in the pre-ovulation phase, your cycle would lag a couple of days. Okay, it went one direction or the other. Again, let's realize what's happening here. The women who are receiving this know nothing about the experiment. They're just saying, we're just interested in seeing if we put alcohol on your lip. Maybe this is the cover story. If we put alcohol on your lip, if it has any bearing on any of your biology. And they ask a whole bunch of questions, about the biology and all these other things. And they actually took secretions from, a woman's genitalia in order to do these sorts of measures. So this was a much, much more carefully designed test where there's no real self-reports. These are all objective ways of measuring ovulation and menstruation without the women ever really knowing what this is about. And it still does shift the cycle one way or the other, which I think is just a really compelling demonstration that, yeah, I think, in fact, there is something to do with the secretions of one woman's body that influences another woman's body through the olfactory system, through the smell system. Okay. Now, let me take a tiny break here and see what type of questions we have. I know we often get these questions. Oh, I broke the mic. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me? I didn't really. Okay, sorry. Oh my God, what happens when the freeway, do you guys smell that? I don't know that one. I'm sorry, we're not gonna. Did they test the sweat of happy people? Chelsea asked a really good question. I do not know of any research that conveys happiness like this. So versus fearful, I'm not sure of that one. Sorry. With the smell of fear, does that compare to when other people are nervous? It can make, yes. So that's exactly what I'm saying. That when a person is presented an undetectable smell from a fearful person, it does very subtly affect kind of the heightened, kind of arousal, kind of vigilance of that person. So that eye blink thing that's done with sound is actually made larger. You blink kind of with more amplitude, as if it's making you a little bit more nervous. That's exactly what it is. No. I'm assuming that none of the women in the experiment were on hormonal. Yes, that's absolutely true. Samantha asked a great question. Assuming that none of the women in the experiment were on hormonal birth control. Otherwise, I don't think this. Yes, you are absolutely right. These these were experiments that were run in the 70s or 80s. So I don't know if that many women were on that type of birth control at that point anyway. But yes, all these experiments control for all this sort of stuff. You can imagine how difficult these experiments are. They are really kind of tricky to run. Okay, Samantha wants to know, different Samantha wants to know, what was the pre-ovulation results again? So depending on if the secretions were taken from the underarm swabs of a woman going through pre-ovulation or or ovulation, the kind of undetectable, unconscious smell applied to receiver women would have an effect over their cycle. So now you have two groups of women that are receiving the smell, undetectable again, receiving the smell, and depending on what type of donor they get, an ovulating donor or a pre-ovulating donor, it will shift the cycle in one direction or the other. So it's a very kind of systematic manipulation that has a very systematic sort of result. I don't remember the exact details. It's in the book. I'm not going to ask you about which direction it goes in anyway, but I believe if they were getting the ovulation smell, it would shift their cycle forward a few days, so they would get their period 2 days earlier. If they were getting the pre-ovulation smell, it would shift their cycle backward a couple of days. I think that's right, but I don't need you to know the details of which one went in which direction, just the fact that it can do it. Okay? Other questions? How are we doing? We're doing good. Good. All right. So we got 10 minutes. I'm just going to zoom through this. I'm not going to change myself into another animal or anything like that. Instead, I'm just going to go full force into this stuff. Okay. We still have a lot to talk about. So what I'd like to talk about now is kind of different types of pheromones and how they might influence the body. I'm going to move back, though, and talk about what we science seems more comfortable talking about, which is pheromones in animals. There's still a lot of controversy over the pheromone story with people. I think there's a nice story there, and I agree with Martha on this, but I'm going to be more cautious because I don't want to misrepresent the field about whether pheromones truly affect people. Okay, so here's the idea. A primer pheromone is the type of pheromone that we've been talking about. It is a pheromone that with mice, we do know this, it can actually shift a mouse's menstrual cycle. It can shift the menstrual time, the period time, so it matches other mice. And that's been studied very systematically with, just presenting the smell to different mice to see if it shifted it. So, I think scientists feel pretty comfortable that there is such a thing as pheromones in the animal world, and it does do that for mice. And they call those primer pheromones because they kind of prime the body's biology to go subtly in one direction or the other. Another type of pheromone, though, that is often discussed seems to have a more kind of immediate and dramatic sort of response to it. and it's called a releaser or a reflexive pheromone. So this is considered to be a different class of pheromones that in animals kind of induce a kind of spontaneous behavior, okay? And we kind of already talked about one of those. We talked about, if an ant smells another ant's fear, it will go, whoosh, it will run away. The same thing happened with mice. If a mouse has been threatened in a certain part of the forest because a hawk tried to come down and grab it, and it got away, it's going to release a pheromone that's going to signal other mice to stay away. So here I am, I'm the new mouse, not the one that's been threatened, and I'm walking through the forest. This is how mice walk, by the way. And all of a sudden I smell that first mouse's fear. I go, whoa, and I'm out of here, and I run for cover. And it is like, if you watch videos of this, it is like a reflex. There's other things for reproduction. There's the pig mating stance. So the idea, if a female pig is going through its estrus, it's the phase of its period where it can actually get pregnant. It's in heat, right? And it smells the presence of another pig, a male pig, nearby. Supposedly it will go into a stance that kind of makes the copulatory act easier. So it will change its position and allow the male pig to copulate more easily. So that's considered to be a releaser pheromone influence, because the male pig's scent, the pheromone, seems to induce some sort of reflexive, kind of major spontaneous reaction in the pig. So it's, making the copulatory act more effective. And so these kind of reflexive actions that seem to be induced by this kind of pheromone influence would be considered influences by a type of pheromone that's called a releaser pheromone. Okay, so those are the two types that are discussed in the context of animals. The primer pheromone is the one that kind of subtly shifts the biology of one animal based on the biology of another animal. And the one you can think of here is the menstrual cycle. That's a very clear one. Certainly works in mice and deer and things like that. And the other one's more dramatic. It's a releaser pheromone. It's the pheromone influence then that's going to induce like a reflex in an animal, whether it's scattering if you're an ant, or a mouse, or going into that mating stance if you're a piggy. Okay? What about humans? Do humans show this sort of thing? Well, what about primer? Well, we just talked about that. I mean, I think there's fairly good evidence, I would say, that in fact women do tend to entrain their menstrual cycles. Do we know for a fact it's based on pheromones or based on smell? And I would say that Martha McClintock, I think that second study, not the one with the dorms, but the one where she applies it to the lips, I think is a pretty compelling bit of evidence that in fact that is something that works. Also, there is some evidence that when a woman lives with a man, that they will regularize their menstrual cycles. So if it can kind of shift from month to month, a few days here and there. With men in the house, it becomes more consistent, a woman's menstrual cycle. It becomes more consistent, and it is thought, based on some experiments, that the men's odor does that. And so in other words, you can do the experiment where a woman's not living with a man; she's living on her own, but she gets the undetectable odor of a man. Her cycle will regularize. A man present or a man's smell can influence how regular a woman's menstrual cycle is. Okay, but what about releaser pheromones in humans? And I think it's very clear we don't show the same sort of reflexive reaction to smells that pigs have, for example. If a woman is in her ovulatory phase and she smells a guy around, somewhere around, there's no sort of reaction that's anything close to what a female pig seems to show. Nothing like that at all. Fear? Well, we just talked about that in the previous slide, right? If a fearful smell is presented to us, it does have a very subtle effect, but nothing like scattering. Nothing like I'm going to run away when I smell that smell from a guy who's been scared. It's not like that. The only time there's one type of reflexive sort of action you sometimes do see in infants, and this is even not clear as well, but I thought I'd talk about it. What you're seeing there is a picture from the actual study. It's kind of cute. There's a newborn infant that will start kind of trying to wriggle his little newborn body towards a sample of his mother's odor versus another woman's odor. Okay, so you will see, and the question is whether that's truly reflexive, right? Is that like a reflex that's kind of unconscious, like the knee reflex or the eye blink reflex or something like that? But you do see it systematically that an infant, newborn, barely can crawl, can't really crawl at all, can just do a little wriggling, right? If their mother's scent is put in the crib with them, it's a little, you can see there's a little patch right here, they will start orienting themselves towards it and wriggling. So is that something like is that based on a releaser pheromone? Is the smell of their mom actually causing a kind of spontaneous behavior? Possibly. It's very hard to know with infants what their experience is like. Like, is the infant like, I can't help this, here I come, mommy? Or is it having some sort of conscious experience that, hey, that must be mommy around the corner, I'm going to go say hi. It's hard to know what's considered a reflex with an infant in this case. All right, well, let's go on and talk about this. And we can talk about this more in the context of compatibility. And boy, I think you're going to find this stuff interesting. I want to make sure I talk about it enough. So I have very few minutes here. I want to make sure that we can go through this as much as possible, though. What Martha argues, Martha McClintock, and other people that study pheromones in humans, is that these two types of pheromone classes that we talk about in animals, the releaser type, the ones that release this kind of reflexive behavior, and the primer type might be too restrictive when it comes to humans. Humans are much more complicated than mice and ants, right? And deer, right? And so when it comes to pheromones, we might want to, kind of loosen our criteria a little bit and talk about other types of pheromones that can convey some type of information, but might not induce such kind of reflexive, automatic sorts of behaviors in the person who's doing the smelling. So Martha argues there's such a thing in humans, possibly animals too, but certainly in humans, that we can call signaler pheromones. And what a signaler pheromone would be are things that we've considered before. So the idea that the smell of a person can tell another person who the first person is, potentially, if you're familiar with them, right? We know that the smell of a person can convey something about whether it's a sibling. Turns out you can also determine whether a natural smell is from a male or woman, a male or female, right? Gender, and something to do with reproductive potential, which we can talk about a little bit more in a second. But all of these things can be determined from a t-shirt test. We talked a little bit about reproductive potential. You get 10 t-shirts, especially if a woman's the one that's the subject, you get 10 t-shirts. And in fact, you will have a preference for one of them. And there's a reason why your preference might have something to do with the reproductive potential, okay? We will talk about that more on Thursday. I think you're going to find this really, really interesting. Have a good couple of days. We'll see you Thursday.